Expedition 44! Welcome back to the show. Thank you for tuning into the podcast, if that's where you are today. We are on a series on the church, and we're starting out with 7 letters to the churches in Revelation. So today we are on the church of Sardis, and that's Revelations 3, 1 through 6.
All right, so it says, "To the angel in the church of Sardis write, he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars says this, I know your deeds, and you have a name that you are alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen the things that remain, which were about to die. For I have not found your deeds complete in the sight of my God. So remember what you have received and heard, and keep it and repent. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief, and you will not know the hour which I come to you. But you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches."
All right, so Matt and I, whether you usually get this or not, are into textuals of criticism, textual criticism, trying to understand exactly how we can take in the total understanding of the text at hand. And one of the main things that we do when we do that is we want to look at what is the background or the context that everybody, if this was being written to you, what would you have understood? Where would you have been at? And so this one is a little bit different than the others. It's still one of the churches on the Mall route, a real church that happens, but it's a little bit different because you would have to know kind of the long-grown history to get the whole context of this letter. Where the other ones, it kind of helps you a little bit, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say this one, there's a little bit in this that if you don't know the drawn-out history, you're just going to be scratching your head, and you're actually probably not going to come to the right interpretation if you don't know it. So let's talk about the background.
Yeah, so one of the textures of interpretation when we talk a little bit about textual criticism is looking at the historical, cultural interpretation of the text. And so in the background here, we got Sardis, which was basically a fortress city. It was surrounded on 3 sides by these extremely steep cliffs.
Now, before we go anywhere with this is what, in the ancient world, what was the ideal. Like, if you wanted to, if you were worried about anybody coming in, everybody was worried about somebody else coming in. If you wanted to build something that was going to stand the test of time, you would build it like a fortress, typically whether you're war people or pacifists or anything. And so the place where we kind of, get this, as you might remember, after 70 AD, you're going to have all these Jews that are going to go up in Masada and basically hang out in this fortress place, and they were trying to protect themselves from the Roman government. And so all of this is in their mind when this is going on.
Yeah, so this is a city surrounded 3 sides by cliffs. As a result, it was considered to be impenetrable. There's one way in and basically one way out.
So how far back do we have to go to get the context of this?
Pretty far. So first, before we get back into some of the history behind that, there's this idiom that's connected to Sardis that's kind of important. So if you were to hear to capture the acropolis of Sardis in the ancient world, it's pretty much an idiom that says it's a feat that something is impossible to do. Kind of like today, it'd be like saying that's impossible, and say to capture the acropolis of Sardis was that idiom.
Or today, you hear the term crossing the Rubicon all the time. In fact, nobody really knows what that means. If I said, give me the history on what it means to cross the Rubicon, people would be like, I'm not actually sure. I just know it's like something really hard that you have to work for, and it's almost impossible, and there's going to be a cost to it. So we get the euphemism with crossing the Rubicon, and I would even take that euphemism and say it was similar to that, but it was even more than that.
Yep. So we got in the 5th century that Cyrus, who's the king of Persia, caught Sardis' armies by surprise, and then he besieged the city. But even after like this 14-day siege, Sardis thought they were safe. So kind of the first historical event that we need to look at is in the 5th century BC, Cyrus, king of Persia, caught Sardis by surprise, and so he kind of catches their armies off guard, and there's this 14-day siege. But even throughout that, the people of Sardis believed they were safe because they were surrounded still on 3 sides by these steep cliffs. So on the 14th day, they basically had no one stationed on these cliffs, and a few of the troops from Persia scaled the cliffs, came over, and overtook the city.
So there's a lot of things that go, how do you lose a city that's considered to be impenetrable like that? Was it a little bit of like overconfidence? Was it a little bit of like just silliness or thinking that you were better than the encroachers. I mean, your city's under siege, so you would think that you would be watching out, being very watchful over everything. But there was almost an arrogance that came with this.
Yeah, so it's pointing here to the lack of vigilance in that area, in an area they thought they needed to pay no attention to because it was so fortified that it actually led to the downfall of the city.
Now, this is one of those things, everybody's experienced something in your life where it's the history of you and it's like stayed with you forever. Yeah. And so this is the history that will haunt Sardis forever. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows that they as a big national entity totally blew it. That never should have happened in history. And it kind of hangs over their heads forever. And we're talking 500 to 600 years later, well, 550, so 450, 500 years later, and it still is in the remembrance. Now, we don't have this concept because as Americans, we haven't been around that long. Yep. A couple hundred years is different than 500 years. So if you can kind of think of that, this is still in their thinking, and it's been 500 years.
Yeah, and so this concept plays into Jesus' message to the church. So put a bookmark there for when we get to that. Now, in 17 AD, about maybe 40, 50 years before when this was written, there was a huge earthquake that ripped through Sardis all of a sudden and almost destroyed the entire city.
Yeah. A natural chaos monster. Yeah. And so we talk about chaos monsters all the time, and in the ancient world they were always wondering if things that happen naturally in calamity were of God or not. Did God send this, or did this just sort of happen? So in the back of their mind, now they're also questioning that.
Yeah, so all this kind of plays in together. Sardis was a city of great wealth, but it also had a history of being overtaken by sudden destructions, and John uses these, and Jesus uses this to talk about spiritual matters, these examples of their history, and so he plays into that. So first we get to the descriptions of Jesus. Like in all the letters, Jesus starts out with describing something about himself that needs to apply to this church. And so the first thing is, it says that talks about he's the one with the 7 spirits. So there's a few views on what these 7 spirits are. It could be 7 spiritual beings, which later in Revelation are the ones that pour out the bowls. Yeah. But also could be the 7 spirits listed in Isaiah chapter 11, verses 1 to 2. And I go more with that view. And so this connects kind of like to last week with the rod of iron that comes from God's mouth. And it says this: a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. It says, the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding and of counsel and of might, and the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord.
So I think this is a good take. In fact, this is one of these places where we don't really even need to get to the right answer. You know, there's not a lot of carryover that's going to make a lot of difference on which view you take, whether you think it's, 7 actual spiritual beings related to the ones at the bowls later, or you go with Isaiah. The problematic thing to me in Isaiah is that we get, this is the Spirit, Matt just read this, is the Spirit of the Lord, wisdom, understanding, counsel, power. There really aren't 7 of them. Yeah, you read it, and there's maybe 6, maybe 5. And so you're going, if it's 7, wouldn't there be 7? But then, that's actually not all that uncommon in Hebrew literature to say there's 7, because numbers represent things that might not be the actual one, or something might be hid. For instance, Expedition 44 is this number of the completeness of 22 doubled, but sometimes it was 44, sometimes it was 42. There's a number 70 in the Bible that actually ends up being 72 a lot of times. And so in Jewish literature, particularly apocryphal literature, numbers are kind of vague. They could mean things. So don't write it off because it doesn't fit right away.
And some will say the Spirit of justice is one that's in there, that's listed elsewhere in there. But Enoch's 61:11 refers back to this verse in Isaiah and says that it's the 7 spirits before the Lord. And so does Psalms of Solomon 17:37. So in the Second Temple period, even though there might not have been 7 things listed there, these 2 apocryphal books attribute the 7 spirits before the Lord to this text.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is when you get to Enoch and you read the spirits, and there are 7 that are listed, they're slightly different than the ones in Isaiah, even though I would say it's directly correlative. And so when you get to Enoch, it's faith, wisdom, patience, mercy, judgments, peace, and goodness, and that comes to a point of one voice together. And so they sound very similar to the ones in Isaiah, but maybe we're given a little bit different of a flavor. So again, we don't have to figure this one out. In fact, I'm even going to say we can't figure it
Yeah.
out. Like I say this all the time. We don't have the cards, and it doesn't matter. Faith, wisdom, patience, mercy, judgment, peace, goodness, wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, fear of the Lord. Those things are all kind of synonymous. One of them is often interpreted, particularly in Hebrew, when we get those words, to mean the same thing as the other ones. And so if I interpret something as wisdom and Matt interprets it as understanding, it could be coming off of the same Hebrew word to get there, and they both mean the same thing.
Yeah, and so I think the big idea about these seven spirits, it's all about the fruit of that the Spirit produces, and it's the idea that spiritual fruit is rooted in Jesus and resembles the life of Jesus. So we see all of that pointing to Jesus.
So everything points to Jesus, and then I'm going to say I might sit with the number as the importance. And so, 7 we know has a lot of significance, and we talked about this with 7 stars. And so I'm going to say don't be so worried about maybe the wisdom, understanding, power parts of them. I mean, we know that picture. We know who Jesus is already. We get a lot of that. We don't have to figure it out. So what's the significance of the 7?
Yeah, so back in our Ephesus episode, we talked about the 7 stars, and so it was all about who is truly king, who holds the 7 stars. We saw that there was coins that Caesar's son, the Son of God, holding the 7 stars, but Jesus is the true Son of God, the one who holds the universe, the one who is truly king. It's just, and so when we were looking at Sardis here, the big thing is about Jesus' description. It's spiritual in nature again. So Sardis has the appearance of being alive on the outside, but they're actually dead.
Yeah.
That's kind of the big thing. They are dying spiritually because they're not following the true king.
Yeah, that's good. And so there's kind of, I think we're good on that, on the 7 of just saying, like, this is the authority that you need to come to, and it's kind of a backwards servant humility authority, but it's also going to be, you need to listen to this because this is the authority on the universe. If you're worried about, if you thought you were impenetrable and your walls fell when you didn't think so, and then you were wondering if this earthquake or whatever came from the Lord, like, there is a little bit of a connotation of you thought those were powerful. I'm the one that is over the universe, so to speak.
And sometimes when we're trying to stand in our own strength and do things under our own strength, we have blind spots.
Yeah.
That through the Spirit might help fortify and bring those things to light, so that He can bring us forward and work on those things to be more conformed to the image of Christ.
So when we see the words alive but dead, this is Jesus' correctional language to them. So almost all the letters kind of, have a flavor of encouragement, but then corrections. So when we get to Sardis, we get this kind of watchful eye language of look at your history, look where you're going, things like that. And what it kind of comes to is what they're called on the carpet for is playing church, so to speak.
Yeah, so they have this reputation. It says they have a name to those in the community for being alive. On the outside, they look good, but Jesus says they're actually dead.
Yeah, and we get this a lot. So we're still in the very beginning format of our church series. So we're really just looking about, this is what the early church taught and did in the book of Acts. This is the first checkup, the doctor checkup of how they're doing. And when it gets to Sardis, how are you doing? It says, well, you're doing okay, but you're trying to look alive on the outside when in fact the inside is dead. And there's a lot of carryover that we'll get to today, that this is an accurate description of, for the last 2,000 years, of many churches that we've had too, is there's might be programming or past achievements or footprints in the community and, public things going on and doing a lot of work to really this is a healthy church. We've got the looks on the outside. We got the cool signs. We've got all this going on.
We've got this amount of people
We've
attending.
got 4,000 people that attend our weekly messages and all this stuff. But are you doing what I said was really important? Are you missing the mark? And sometimes even it's the work that is dead. And so there's going to be some language that comes out of here. And I know sometimes I feel like a broken record if I say salvation is simply the first step towards the sanctification process. It's opening your mind and giving your heart, making an allegiant profession of faith to come to it. But that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is discipleship. We're supposed to be intimate, all-in disciples and bring others to that. And of course, you need the plan of salvation at the beginning. But that's why Matt and I get hung up here a lot, is because oftentimes that's the look good thing. Yeah. Let's get all these people saved because it looks great in our culture. But then what we're supposed to be doing is actually dead.
Yeah. So I think probably hopefully in a month or so, we're going to have Frank Viola on to talk about really why the the American church model isn't set up to make disciples.
Yeah. We got Scott McKnight coming on tomorrow,
Yep.
and he's going to talk a little bit about this too.
Yeah. So, kind of the thing here is you can have all of these good things, outward appearances, that give off an appearance of life, but it can actually be dead works because it lacks the work of the Spirit in the church.
So the what we're looking for is, you might remember back in like Colossians and then Corinthians get into this too.
Mm-hmm.
It's bearing fruit. Matt and I always make a joke of bear fruit, like a bear holding fruit or something like that.
Because it's cool. Sure.
That's the culmination of how you get your checkup. So we're kind of talking doctor's checkup here. And how do you know that you're doing well? It's the fruit that you bear.
Yeah, so let's read Colossians 1, 9, and 10, because I think that really points out to like Paul's view to the Colossian church. It says, for this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through the wisdom and the understanding the Spirit gives. Sounds like those 7 spirits. So that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you might have great endurance and patience, and give joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light.
So we are representations, ambassadors in the kingdom of light. Our job is to bear fruit in every good work that we do. And then when we do that, we represent the king himself, so that when people see us, they're seeing a mirror image of the king himself. Now, we are not great at that. But what we're asked to do, and this is, again, an Expedition 44 meaning, is that we're asked to bring all that we have, to be all in, completely, our families, everybody about us, we bring those, and then we ask that God take what we put on the altar as a living sacrifice and enumerate that. And that's double portion language, and that's how we get from 22 to 44. But that's exactly what he's talking about here, growing in the knowledge of the Lord, and it's deep understanding. It's talking about the way that you walk should be deeply that you're walking with the Lord every day.
Yeah, so it's not just dead, lifeless, actless faith going through the motions. It's truly being intimate with the Lord, and that's that intimacy with him in the Spirit brings about these good works. It's not just good works and checking boxes.
So when we hear it, it's not what it looks like on the outside. It's actually what it really is on the inside. It's that discipleship language again, that I'm actually not really concerned with how this looks, to everybody else. We need to represent the Lord, but what we're concerned about is getting to the point where everything inside of you bears fruit.
So next, Jesus uses this phrase to the church to strengthen what remains. And so Jesus tells the church to wake up, which actually in Greek is better translated as be watchful, echoing back to that story we told you earlier of Sardis being overtaken because they weren't watchful. And Jesus is telling them that they truly need to be watchful. And he tells them to strengthen what remains. And actually the word Sardis in Greek means the remains. Kind of talking about that earthquake. He said, so strengthen the things that are left.
I'm going to get into this later, but Sardis is an interesting word because we don't know exactly what it means. A lot of times when you go to Wikipedia, you kind of see this is exactly what the word means, and Sardis doesn't mean anything else. And so what does it mean? It's that which what remains, but it's also that which what remains, and there's a connotation for the word red, which we'll get into in a few minutes of it. It seems that it was like a red hill, and when they were invaded or when things started to fall apart, that what the outcome was you saw red. And today that's become, we even use that in our thing, and we don't get that it was kind of this actually could be, when you say you're seeing red or code red, it actually could be
from Sardis.
It could be from Sardis. That might be where we got that. And so if you're having a code red, it means things are falling apart, something's wrong, and you have a code red, and that's the word of Sardis, that it meant this is not going very well, that
be watchful.
Be watchful, strengthen it up, get it together, figure it out, whatever. And it's interesting that this seems to be connotation language that is all about Sardis, but it's also used in the rest of the Bible. And so I don't see any reason why, when we start reading these same words in 1 Peter 4:7 or 1 Peter 5:8, you guys know that, be on your guard. And it's actually, the word be watchful is it's the same phrase in 1 Peter 4:7. Be watchful in your prayer. What did that mean? It was likely rooted in this relationship to Sardis.
Yeah, so Jesus says, strengthen what remains, but what does he mean by what remains?
Right.
He could mean that there are some in the church that have remained faithful, that are the faithful remnant. He could also be talking about fruit. So there's some of the fruit has fallen aside, but there's some fruit that's left, and he wants that stuff to be strengthened. He talks about this in verse 2. So
and it's dynamic.
Yeah.
I think this
could be both.
This is again made to be on a circular mail route, which is preached and make sure it's lived out, and then it's going to go on, and that letter is going to, they're going to read that and go, oh, look what's going on in Sardis. What do we get out of it? So it also has this flavor. So many of the circular letters had of this is the message for them. This is the intended recipient of the audience, but there's also things in it that everybody can take away, and this is that flavor of what do we take away.
Yeah. So the big thing is that Jesus has not found Sardis's works or their fruit complete in the eyes of God. Yeah. I think Sardis is really similar to the Pharisees.
Yeah.
And so if you look at Matthew 23 verses 25 to 28, yeah. So Jesus says this to the Pharisees, and I think it kind of has some overlap here. It says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but on the inside you are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisees, first clean the inside of the dish, and then the outside will also be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law, Pharisees, you hypocrites! You whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead bones, and everything is unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you're full of hypocrisy and wickedness."
Yeah. You also get, when you get to Galatians 5 and fruits of the Spirit language, that all the acts of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit kind of together are external actions, but what is really important is what's going on inside, the core of your heart, who you are.
Yeah, so the fruit of the Spirit are rooted on internal spiritual things that overflow to the outside. It's kind of also the desires with the flesh, too, originate on the inside with greed and lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, but all overflow to things that create destruction on the outside.
Now, you probably got some of this, but a lot of this is actually even going to go back to the garden, and I'm going to get into some of this a little bit more, but this is Old Testament cultivation language. So when you're talking about the inner workings of the heart and how that flushes out externally, it's what are we made to do? We're to nurture. We were gardeners. Yeah. That's what Jesus actually is described as the gardener. And so the idea is that we're sowing seeds, and people, again, go back to sowing seeds as something that happens for salvation, when actually the context of seed sowing wasn't necessarily salvation. It was discipleship. And so when today it's really unfortunate that when we talk about sowing seeds, we go right to salvation, because it's sowing seeds were a bountiful harvest, something that you needed to continue for the replenishing of your whole community together. It was more than just you and me. It was a huge footprint.
Yeah, so Jesus kind of gets into that they can't be faithful witnesses in their life if they're not built on the dependence of the Holy Spirit. That's kind of the big idea here of strengthening what remains, is that they need to be built by a Spirit-led life, which submits to the leading of the Spirit of God, cultivating those seven spirits in them. And they said if this doesn't happen, Jesus says the consequences are coming. He says if they don't repent, if they don't change their thinking, if they don't change their actions and change their allegiances, that he's going to come like a thief in the night.
Yeah. So this is consequential words. We get this in all the letters, sort of. Even in the good letters, we kind of get this in all of them. Of here's where you are. Here's the checkup visit. And like any good, Christ is the healer. Like any good doctor visit, we're going to say, now, what should I be doing? What can I do better? Where can we go from here? So this is the time in the letter where we get to, okay, so here's what's going to happen. If you continue to live as you are, this could be the consequences, but you don't have to choose that.
Yeah. And so he uses the phrase, he's coming like a thief in the night. Yeah. I think a lot of us Westerners, when we hear thief in the night, we hear rapture.
There's a terrible 70s or 80s movie called that. There are probably more than one out there.
Yeah. Thief in the night. Yeah. So is he talking about the rapture? No, you don't want Jesus to come like a thief in the night, where they were like, oh, well, Jesus is coming like a thief in the night to rapture us. So
people get this so wrong all the time.
Backwards.
Like, so let's talk about what that means. Let's talk about like the Matthew 24.
Yeah, I think it's an echo of Jesus' words in Matthew 24, 36 to 44. I'll just read that quick and then we'll make a couple comments on it. But about the day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, the people were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. How is it that it will be in the coming of the Son of Man? 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be gathering with a handmill, one will be taken, the other left. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know what day or hour the Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept better watch and would not have left his house to be broken into. So you must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him.
So let's break this down a little bit. So when you get to the thief in the night, the Greek there is hos kleptos, and we get the word, you might kind of recognize a little bit of that word. We get the word kleptomaniac in that. And somebody steals something. Now, there's two forms of this, and there's actually more in Hebrew, but in Greek there's another word we could take, and that's for a robber. And robbers were kind of seen as people that would just, come and threaten people. So when you read with the term of being robbed, you might remember on the road where the person was beaten and robbed.
The Good Samaritan, yeah.
Yes, that's the idea of a fearful robber. Now, this is different because this is a thief in the night is going to be the connotation that something is stolen right out from you and you don't know. That it's almost a silent happening thing, that it will be unnoticed. And a lot of times, Matt and I look at those dispensationalists maybe that are looking for this, rapture, whatever. We talk about this all the time of like, God's going to come back and kick some butt. That's what people think is like,
Driscoll,
dun, 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 he's going to fight his way into this and he's going to overcome the powers and the systems of the world and everything, when actually the context of this is exactly opposite of that. I mean, it's actually saying you might not notice it. If you're that wrapped up, if you're that entangled, you might not even notice because it's going to happen like a thief in the night. And so,
look at the way Jesus came the first time. It was revealed to kind of the outsiders, the shepherds, and that in the field, but it wasn't this huge.
Wasn't this amazing proclamation? Yeah. Now, some people were looking for it. In fact,
and they found it.
They did. Even some of the more watchful people were the ones that were against Jesus looking for it. When you think of the term of Herod and things like that, so some people will be looking, but the thing about it here is that is how do we look? How are we positively going forward? Because there's an idea that the robber thief language is important here, because some people are looking for robber language, and this is thief language, not robber language. It's also important to kind of look at, again, go back to the context. We talked a lot at the beginning of what's the context of the letter, and when I read this, I see declarations about Jerusalem being destroyed in 70 AD, and that's why
the context of Matthew.
I have a hard time not dating this before 70 AD, because I read this in the apocalyptic literature that was written at the same time of this. Even if it wasn't Christian apocalyptic literature, it's still looking at the same type of language going on, saying, our world is about to collapse here.
And so in the text here in Matthew 24, it talks about Jesus is coming compared to the days of Noah. Now, in the days of Noah, did you want to be taken or left?
That's a good question. Don't we all want to be like taken up in the clouds whatever?
No, in the days of Noah, the ones taken, the way Jesus uses it here, the ones taken were the ones that were killed in the flood.
Yeah.
Were the ones that were
the raptured ones died.
The ones left were Noah and his family. So you want to be left behind.
Right.
You want to be the ones that remain, because when Jesus comes and divides his people from the ones that are part of the kingdoms of this world, we want to be on Jesus' side.
And this fits really a lot of things. Like, if you're dispensationalist and you have these wild views of 144,000 that are going to stay behind and lead the way, like, actually that would be kind of honorable to be in that group that's considered that. So that's where we kind of go back to, thinking across the lines. Like, a lot of them just don't make sense, and we're trying to come up with the best overall lens of theology. And this is, if you're thinking this rapture type thinking, we've got more videos coming that are going to address some of this stuff. But right now, you're probably thinking the wrong way if that's where you're going. It's actually, I would even argue, it's not biblical. It's not a very biblical way of thinking. It's more of the world's way than it is the biblical way.
Yeah, so the left behind are actually the ones that survive. They're the ones that are alive. They're the remnant.
Yep.
And so Jesus attributes his coming like a thief in the night here as well, similar to what we talked about with Sardis. Like Sardis's history of not being ready, not being prepared, and the armies overtaking the city is that you want to be living by the Spirit. You want to be ready. You need to be following Jesus as a disciple, not ignoring those places in your life where he's calling us to repent.
Right.
And that's the whole thing of him coming. He's like, if you don't do these things, when I return, it's not going to be good, because you're going to be found on the sides of the kingdoms of this world and in their systems.
Now, we use remnant language a lot. In fact, that's again what Expedition 44 is all about, is we consider ourselves like the remnant of those faithfully looking to be the biblical term of disciples in a world where, or particularly in America, where that is totally lost. But the problem is remnant is a middle of the road term. It doesn't necessarily mean all those that are totally in it. Means remnant is better. It's like, it's first fruits thinking. So in the Old Testament, like, there's so many places that call us to live in our first fruits, to put the best part of our week first, to bring to the culture of our community the best that we have first before we go back to our life. But that wasn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal was that it wouldn't just be our first fruits, it would be everything. And so that's New Testament language. So when you get this language of remnant, what it's communicating, you got to be careful to see this, is they weren't even quite at the remnant stage. And so they were being called to first fruit remnants language, even though where God really wants them to be is up here. And so this is the doctor checkup that's important to get right here, is this was a community that looked really good on the old outside, but when it really comes down to it, they weren't even hitting the middle of the road of where Jesus wanted them to be.
So the next thing in the text, he talks about soiled garments. So Jesus mentions that there are some in the church that are faithful, kind of like what we saw in Pergamum and Thyatira, that aren't spiritually dead, so they're kind of in that remnant world. But he talks about soiled garments, which he tells them not to have. So the soiled garments is usually a way of talking about impurity, being stained by the world. Jude verse 22 talks about this also, about not being stained from the world as you're pulling people from the fire, kind of. And then also he talks about that these people that aren't stained will walk in white, for they are worthy. And this has echoes of Eden, of walking in the garden with God.
So let's talk about that. This is really where the original breakdown happens. And so you have this problem that what happens is what was created was sacred space. We were supposed to merge in this partnership where we would walk with God in this deep, devoted intimacy. And what happened was the sacred space became impure. It was toiled. And so when you get into that, that's where you kind of get into soiled garments. And the Greek is moluno, and it means to smear with mud. And I sit there and I go, what does that mean? Now, this is really neat. So to smear to mud is earth words. Those are words of something got defiled, essentially. So if I come out of working in my shop and I'm covered in dirt and mud and I'm black and dirty, my wife doesn't want to give me a hug. Why doesn't she want to give me a hug? Because I'm not clean. I'm not pure to her. It's a lot better if I get dressed up on a Saturday night and take a shower and put cologne on. And that's what she wants to embrace. That's kind of what leads to deeper intimacy. And so when you talk about hands dirty, it goes back to being toiled. It's the impurities that brought in that turned walking with the Lord into the toil of work. And so there's a lot going on there that, kind of goes through there. And so this also is going to become later in Levitical priest language. And so you might remember that a priest could not entertain their normal works if they didn't meet a certain set of qualifications. And so we've gone through videos where we've talked about what the priests wear, and those were connotations of what's happening inside. And so that gets into this too. But these are all... in Hebrew, if your garments were defiled, all the garments went through this huge process of cleanliness and purity, so they weren't defiled because everybody was counting on you. And so you got to get this sense in this letter too, that this is community language. And this is so important because at some point it seems like the message, like today when you go listen to a Sunday morning church service, everything is meistic. Everything is about what are you doing to honor the Lord. And I've gone through this a little more, but in Hebraic thought, it was so much more than that.
What are we doing?
What are we doing? What is your family? Today, Matt and I are part of this incredible micro church family, and we practically raise each other's kids sometimes and stuff like that. I mean, everybody walks into everybody's house and, we hang out and we just do Jesus all the time together. And we do that because that was the flavor of the Bible from day one. That's what it's really supposed to be like. In fact, that's really temple sacred language is that we're together in this. So when we think of it today, we think in more terms of moral failure, moral defilement. Like, have you sinned? What are you doing? But there's a ritual element to this where not all is sin, and you're not supposed to bring that too. And so is being muddy sinful? No, it's not being sinful, but it's a ritual defilement. For instance, we try to keep these PG-rated films, but I just got to use this example because it's probably the one that you would get is today when a woman's menstruating, we really don't know. I mean, if you're married to him, you might say, well, I know, or whatever, but you really don't know, where in an ancient context, that was actually usually pretty visible when that was happening. And so that was a kind of a thing of defilement. If you were mourning the dead and you had touched dead, you were defiled. If you there's bodily fluids language, things like that. There's lists of how you were ritually defiled, and it wasn't actually
None of
like
that was sinful.
Yeah,
it was biological.
But you were still between God. There was something going on. So if you were a priest in that thing, I'm sure there are many times where priests could not do their language or do their rituals, because if they did, they were not in a place according to the law that said that they could do that. And we don't think this way. We typically just think of, what about me? And so what's important is when this is being written, they're still thinking Hebraically that they represent a whole community of believers, and they have responsibility to live pure, righteous lives, not only in morally, but also in rituals. And today, this has a huge connotation to our church, is we think we're only responsible for ourselves, when actually when we're part of the body of believers, there's a whole lot bigger sense of family responsibility going on than that. And they hadn't lost it by the time this letter is written, and this is like the last thing that we get. And so I'm going to just say we shouldn't lose this today. Like, we should still have this, because the last letter that we have says this is important.
Yep. So we'll talk a little bit more about white garments here in a little bit at the end, but next, Jesus, like in every single one of these letters, he tells them that he wants this church to conquer. And remember, we have to reiterate this every time, because it's important, is we don't conquer Rome's way, we conquer Jesus' way, the way of the slaughtered lamb, the power under, not power over, way of conquering. And so Jesus gives two rewards to the conquerors here. One is white garments, and the other is that their name will not be erased from the book of life. Okay. And so we're going to first talk just a little bit about white garments. We touched upon that, but white garments are mentioned a ton in Revelation. Yeah. And so we got Revelation 3:18, Revelation 4:4, Revelation 6:11, Revelation 7:9, 7:13, and 19:14. So in white represented purity. It was what the early church wore even when they were baptized. Yep. They would wear white garments, and so it was a wardrobe that seems like it's those identified with those who have the mark of the Lamb and those who are part of God's kingdom and not the world's kingdom. Yep. And so that's really what this representation of wearing white was. It was something that also would have meant something to the people in Sardis, because the typical wardrobe of those in Sardis in their everyday life was usually red garments.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Which is kind of interesting. And sometimes they would wear white garments, but that was only like in a victory procession. Yeah. And so this is saying that those who are truly in the victory procession, who are different from the world, are the ones that are wearing white garments.
There is so much here. I could spend another 45 minutes just here, but let me give you some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. So most of the time we think in our world of black and white. Those are opposites. Yeah. What's the opposite of black? Well, it's white. But in a biblical context, that's not it. I talk about contronyms all the time, and the opposite of white is actually red. Yep. And so that's why when you get back into the scapegoat, Day of Atonement thinking, they would this is kippur, expiation language. Yep. You know, the priest is going to do the one sacrifice. There's a cord that was used to tie up that lamb. They take off, they put the cord over the one lamb. That scapegoat is sent off, but they take the cord that's stained in blood, they put it around the Holy Holies, and you might have heard in rabbinical language, and again,
it turns white,
that over the course of a year, it's going to turn white and of course, there's the scriptures that say made white as snow. So we're tainted when we're red, and we're made white as snow when we are in Christ. And so this connotation of red or white language is saying that you're not there. Now, I wrote the book called This Is the Way, and the second one is coming out, and there's a slight Star Wars bend to this, and it's really interesting that the guards of the evil people, like the guards in Star Wars that guard Darth Vader, for instance, and the other ones, wear red. And so other people in culture have picked up on this before, and red tends to be a color of royalty, hierarchy, kingship of the world, when white represents the kingship of the kingdom.
Yep. It's also interesting, Revelation 19:14, the armies of heaven were following him riding white horses dressed in fine white linens, white and clean. Right. And then white also symbolized purity, victory, honor, new birth. Revelation 7:14 says, these who were coming out of the Great Tribulation, they have been washed their robes and have made them white in the blood of the Lamb.
Yeah. So this is biblical wrath language. When he's talking about what's happening, do this, or essentially you could be turned over. Yeah. And so
Romans 1.
Be an overcomer, or you're going to be turned over. And so this goes back again to Genesis language. So when we mentioned earlier that Sardis has this connotation of meaning like the red one, so to speak. And that's wrath language. Red and wrath are almost always tied together. Now, stick to the biblical sense of wrath. That's the problem.
We've got a video on that.
When I say wrath, people go the wrong way. But the biblical sense of red, this is so important. This is how, like, I just can't tell you, like, when you guys watch our videos, you see how everything ties into the whole lens of Scripture over and over and over. Like, this is what we're into, is connecting different patterns of thoughts and theology that makes more sense. And so when you think wrath, the red ones meant your palms were red because that was the work, the toil. And so when you open it up like that, when God said he's turning his hands over to somebody, he's releasing them to the wrath, that was the redness in God's hands that were going out like that. And so this is Cain and Abel language too. So you get Cain, he was a tiller of the ground. That's Adamah, which is red ground, basically, red soil. Yep. And it's talking about things that he was going to have to work the soil because of what happened, the defilement of sacred space in the garden. And so there's all kinds of strife language going on here and saying that you can still overcome. You can still be in this intimate relation that I'm calling you to be. But if you don't, you're going to be released to what the world is, and the world is red.
And toil. Yeah. So
it's also Edom language. You're going to get Moab, Edom stuff going on with the Israelites later, and they're always like that, speaking against brothers. They forgot to love each other. All the things that are of the world were associated with Edom, and God very carefully said to the Israelites, that's not for you. Stay away from that.
So it also seems to be that these white garments are something that we have a part in putting on.
Yeah.
Also, Paul talks about baptism in the book of Galatians as putting on Christ.
Exactly.
And so through our participation in the blood of the Lamb, it actually gives us white garments, is kind of what it's talking about here.
It's that backwards kingdom thing. I mean, how cool is that we're washed in the blood, and as a result
we're white.
That we're white.
Yeah. And so it's taking on the life and the attitude of the kingdom through Jesus' sacrifice and through the work of the Holy Spirit in us. And this all connects back to being alive.
Yeah.
It's backwards from what you would think is alive. It's actually death that brings life.
And it's royal priesthood language all through. So purity, victor, honor, recreated, new birth. You're created for something bigger. This is all what it looks like to wear white, to represent the king of a kingdom that is white and not red.
So the second thing is, we're talking about the Book of Life now. That's the second part of the ones who conquer will not have their names eliminated from the Book of Life. Right. So Jesus says they won't be blotted out. And so Jesus promises salvation to his faithful followers who complete the journey. This is all journey language. So it implies that those who don't finish faithfully can be blotted out from the Book of Life.
Now, let's just pause here because everybody's heard of the Book of Life, but I'm going to probably say that your understanding of the Book of Life isn't very good. Yeah. That most people... Again, I hate to just throw stones at dispensationalism and futurism and escapism and all this kind of stuff, but most of us have an understanding of the Book of Life based on those tenets that aren't really very good. And so let's just kind of go back to like Exodus and talk about the Book of Life.
Yeah. So Moses, he says in Exodus 32, verses 32 and 33, that God tells Moses, whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out from my book.
What's interesting in this is that it would seem like everybody's name is kind of in this light book to start out with. So part of that book I mentioned I wrote like talks about the different ideas of hell and who's going to get there and, universal reconciliation and annihilation and everything else. And this is almost backwards to what everybody thinks. Everybody thinks that you have to attain or make it to be written in the Book of Life.
But most often it talks about being blotted out from it.
It's almost as if everybody's in it until they're out.
And that's actually, we'll get into that. That's the way the books of citizenship worked in the ancient world, in which we'll talk about here in a minute. But also, David in Psalm 69:28 calls for his enemies to be blotted out of the Book of Life. And these are the people who don't follow the Lord, and he says that they might not be numbered among the righteous. And Paul uses the term of his co-workers that their names are written in the Book of Life in Philippians 4:3 about citizenship there.
So there's a lot of other connections here, and again, we could spend 45 minutes making connections all through this, but we won't. So when you hear the word Zion, like in Psalm 69, like we just referenced, you talk about Zion and Jerusalem. Zion really never happened the way it was supposed to be. The idea that was that the Israelites were supposed to be the holy set apart people when they created Jerusalem. That was supposed to be the place where only God dwelled, that was totally holy. There was nothing defiled in the city, and we know it never became that. In fact, that's why people would say that God never really came back.
Yeah,
He never came back to the
Yeah.
came back to the temple because it was too defiled. It wasn't holy anymore. And so you're going to get into you could go to Psalm 139 and read that same thing, and there is a connection to Revelations 13:8 going on there, because it's kind of got that these things were supposed to be this way from the beginning of time. Now, don't get into bad predestination theology here. Again, we don't have time, but some of our other videos have gotten to this a little bit. But the idea is, from the beginning of time, the goal was that we were all supposed to be part of this kingdom. And if you don't make the cut, then it looks like that's where your name is removed. So that totally flies in the face of the way that most churches today go about their business, trying to win people over as if the names are added to the book of life, rather than understanding that in a historical context of Christianity, your name's in the book of life until or unless it's blotted out of the book of life. So Orthodox faith actually, I think, has a much better handle on this than what our evangelical life does today. But again, I'm just going to leave that with you to kind of plant a seed of deeper discipleship and let you work on that in your mind and see where it goes.
Yeah, so let's look a little bit at the first century here of how they use the book of life. Before we kind of
you mentioned citizenship.
Yes.
So
So first century, many cities, including Sardis, had an official register of the names of the citizens there. So if a citizen was condemned for a crime, the city authorities would first blot out their name from the book so that the death sentence could be fulfilled without damaging the city's reputation.
Yeah.
And so we get evidence of this in Dio Chrysostom. So here's a quote from him. And so I now wish to tell you of a practice which I know is followed in Athens and here too. I imagine in accordance with the most excellent law. In Athens, for instance, whenever a citizen has to suffer death at the hands of the state for his crime, his name is to be erased first. Why is this done? One reason is that he may no longer be considered a citizen when he undergoes such a punishment, but so far as possible as having to become an alien.
Oh, that's an interesting word, yeah.
Then too, I, so as far as it is possible, as having become, then too, I presume that it is looked upon as not for the least part punishment itself, so being name removed, but then the appellation should no longer be seen on the man who has gone as far in wickedness, but should be utterly blotted out. Just as I believe traitors are denied burial, so that the future there may be no trace whatsoever of the wicked man. So what he's saying is, so in these cities, your name would be blotted out before you would face the death sentence, so that it would keep the citizenship pure.
And this sounds a lot like Revelation 20 when you get to the thing that those who are not written in the book of life are going to be thrown into the lake of fire, which was originally created for the spiritual beings that fell, and now somehow it looks like there's other people that are now going to be added to that with it too. But we come back to, this is death language.
Yeah, it says the lake of fire is a second death in Revelation 20 and 21. And as Jesus promised those in Sardis, sounds a whole lot like what he said in Smyrna, is that those who conquer will not be hurt by the second death.
Now, there's a huge New Testament debate going on. This is all Israel language with Paul, is that there seemed to be this idea that if you were of Israel, that you were already good. You were just good to go. Somehow you were going to be left in the book of life regardless of what you did. And I think a lot of Paul's writings are dispelling that, saying that no, you need to continue walking the walk, bearing fruit, being an intimate disciple, or your name can't still be blotted out of here. And this comes down to covenant or all kinds of theologies figuring this out. But in Numbers 14:20, there's this really strong connotation. Now remember, Numbers is early in the Bible, and there's this connotation that corporate Israel actually isn't in the book of life. So let that work on you for a second.
So the message to Sardis is to be all in, to be his faithful followers, to reject the world, and in rejecting the world, they may face persecutions, but they're actually citizens of the eternal kingdom, the kingdom of God. So if a Christian in Sardis is to follow Jesus' advice and wake up spiritually, they're going to face trials. They're going to face troubles. They might lose their citizenship in Sardis as a result.
Right.
But they won't lose their citizenship in the kingdom of God.
And that's what they've been taught before this, 15, 20 years, Pauline epistles, is saying that you should take joy in that should be one of your goals, is to get there.
So how does this apply today? So let's wrap up with some thoughts as we conclude.
So many thoughts today. We kind of been all over the place today.
We just kind of want to dissect all the words, dissect all the images, and let's bring it all together. So the question is, do we have churches with good reputations that look alive on the outside, but is it an empire that our pastors, our leaders, ourselves have built, or is it actually built on the Holy Spirit?
And if you didn't get it, I've been kind of reading between the lines that most of our churches look more red today than they do white. And so what we're trying really hard to do is, look like we're successful by the world standard of successful. We have these amazing buildings. We've got CEO pastors. We've got all this stuff that looks great on the outside. It's what the world says is red and, is supposed to be kingdom and everything else. This is what royalty of the world looks like, but it's actually the opposite of what Jesus wants us to look like as corporate community, the body of Christ. We're supposed to look white, not red.
Yeah, and so the question that we also have to ask is, what is fruit?
Yeah.
Is that fruit? Like when you see these things, big buildings, big attendance, I mean, it could be, but the thing is, what it talks about fruit in the Bible is it's all rooted in love, which produces joy and peace and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. Do we see those 7 spirits from Isaiah as well in our churches, or do we see more of a corporate structure of bigger's better, power over, or do we see service? Do we see a culture that looks more like Jesus, or a culture that looks more like corporate America in our churches?
And Matt and I have been alluding to this, that you need to find your tribe. This is tribal language, and that's why I went so far today as to talking about the Old Testament, way that this worked and why the red was important and things like that, because this is communal language through and through. This is saying that in order for this to work, in order to bear fruit, what works for it is to find your first century, First Testament communal family and live together in that way. And that's why Matt and I are just so adamant about, we're involved in a pretty big church together, but at the same time, where we really see God acting in terms of discipleship is in our immediate family. We consider ourselves family, even though we're not there. We're brothers through and through. And you hear people throw around that term a lot, but it's in a worldly connotation of it today. And the biblical sense of it is that we have a responsibility for each other and each other's families, and that we're tribally doing life together.
Yeah, and Frank Viola, who I'm part of like a small group mentorship with him for the last year, which has been awesome, he calls this a kingdom cell. Okay. He's like, sometimes, like the institutional church, it's sometimes hard to create disciples. And we're going to talk to him about this when we have him on. But he's like, you need to, even in those environments, find your tribe, find a kingdom cell that you can do discipleship with. So you need to get together with like-minded people that have the life of the Spirit in them in order to create discipleship.
And sometimes people from the outside world say things like, well, am I supposed to live in a spiritual bubble then? Are your kids living in a bubble? And the answer is probably kind of, that would be great if it happened that way. Don't be soiled by the world is the mindset here, is keep your garments clean. And so, that even being smeared by the mud of the world, even though it's not physical sin, you didn't necessarily do that. When you see the effects of the world smeared on you, it's actually defilement before the Lord. And again, we don't think of it that way. And so I want to keep my community, my family, my representation, we want to be clean before the Lord. And that's what this is talking about.
Yeah, and so ultimately, like the bottom line is like, the soil of the world kills off the work of the Spirit. And so ultimately a church cannot have life without the Spirit working in it. It can look like it's alive on the outside with big buildings and structures and things like that, things that the world might think look alive, but really the dependence upon the Spirit and desperation for Him is the key foundation for what a church needs to be built on. And if you don't have that, you can look as good to the world as you want, but you can actually be dead.
Yeah. So today we kind of get this application to churches where these mega churches, they still see that this is important because they want to have small groups. They want everybody to be involved in a small group. So we're already identifying that at least every church understands that this is part of the framework. The problem, I think, most of the time is most churches see the big group of coming to celebrate one or two people's gifting rather than the giftings of the whole.
Yeah, and they just see small groups as an additional add-on or an extracurricular
part
activity.
Of the programming. How good does it look to everybody else?
Yeah, when it's actually the most essential part of the body of Christ in church life is a Spirit-filled, Spirit-led group of like-minded believers that are going to push you closer to Jesus, but iron sharpening iron, doing life together.
I've heard so many times pastors that are mad when they don't see somebody show up for, 2 weeks in a row or something, like, where are they? They didn't come to the, the big group gathering or whatever. And it depends. I mean, if
they might be in fellowship every day with their
they
people.
might be living it out better than anybody else in the churches. And so that's really a tough concept that we want to come back to the biblical understanding of, is what is it that God is actually calling us to live out each and every day in fervent discipleship with our tribe, that we might be white rather than red as the world is.
May God bless you and keep you.